Leslie Goddard has presenting history lectures and performing first-person programs in the Chicago area for more than 10 years. She holds a PhD from Northwestern University, specializing in American Studies and U.S. history. Leslie is a full-time presenter, a former museum director, and author of 2 books in Chicago history. Her nationally recognized presentations include Illinois Humanities Council Sites, Chicago's Navy Pier, WBEZ Chicago Amplified, Questers International, the Victorian Society in America, and scores of schools, universities, retirement centers, libraries, historical societies, businesses, conferences, and fundraiser. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Leslie Goddard.
Can you hear me okay? Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, good, good. All right, so I have to start by asking, do we have anyone here today who ever worked at a Marshall Field store? Look at that. Good show. How about anyone who had a relative who worked at a Field store? Me, I count there. How about that? How about, is there anyone here who ever shopped at a Marshall Field store? That's like almost everyone, right? Right? When you hear the phrase Marshall Fields, what are the images or the ideas that immediately come to your mind? Shout them out. High quality, customer service. Give the lady what she wants, the great Marshall Fields phrase. The window displays, the walnut room, the clock, yes. This is the cover of my book, Remembering Marshall Fields, and one of the things I said was the cover absolutely must have a photograph of the clock Z. There's 2 of them, actually. Frango Minns, absolutely. I've written 2 books, and my other book is on Chicago candy, and someone pointed out to me, Frango Minns probably went home with more tourists than any other Chicago candy because they were exclusive to Marshall Fields. We could go on and on, but what I think you've just demonstrated very well is that people who have lived in Chicago or grew up in Chicago have very strong memories of Marshall Fields. And I always say, Marshall Fields occupied a very unique place, not only in the minds of Chicagoans, but I think in the pantheon of great Chicago department stores. And I'm really fascinated in the question of why this store inspired incredible loyalty from its customers. People talked about Marshall Fields as my store. You know, there was this ownership connection to Marshall Fields. And I think to really answer that question, we have to go back to the very, very beginning, which is usually given as 1852, to the great founder of the whole empire, who was, of course, Potter Palmer. Potter Palmer was the great founder. This Marshall Field and Company is one of the few great American department stores that was not founded by the person whose name it bore for most of its history. Potter Palmer opened a dry goods store in Chicago in 1852. He was a New York Quaker, was planning to go further west, but stopped in Chicago and thought, this city has it going on. And Chicago, keep in mind, in the 1850 census, Chicago had 30,000 residents. It was Elmhurst today is larger than Chicago was in 1850. But it had this energy and this excitement, terrific location. It was already becoming the commercial nexus of the United States for transportation. So he decides to open his dry goods business in Chicago on the first great commercial thoroughfare of the city, which was, of course, Lake Street. Lake Street, in the very early days, was the great commercial corridor. The reason being, if you know Chicago, Lake Street runs east-west, where the Chicago River runs east-west. It's about a block or two south of the river. So in the days of river transportation, it was extremely convenient to the great wholesale markets that opened up along the Chicago River. This is Lake Street as it looked in the 1860s. By this point, Potter Palmer's dry goods store was that store in the middle that's got the American flag on it. It was the largest store on State Street by this point. In other words, within about 10 years, he had become the biggest wholesale and retail dry goods business in Chicago. Much of the reason was Palmer was extremely innovative and progressive. He brought in luxury goods as well as everyday cottons and wools. He's selling silks and velvets and laces at a point when Chicago's roads aren't even paved. He was an early advocate, and certainly the first in Chicago, to start using, you'll be shocked when I tell you this, one price tagged merchandise. Most storekeepers in the 19th century did not mark prices on their goods because they operated by haggling. Potter Palmer got rid of haggling. He said one price and it's marked on the goods. He was sort of the CarMax of dry goods businesses. And then he introduced what a lot of people thought was his most shocking or progressive idea. He announced anything you purchased at his store could be returned for any reason. Most stores in those days would only accept something back if it arrived damaged or not what you ordered. He said, no, you can return goods, no questions asked. Can you see who he's sort of appealing to here? Not to be gender stereotypical here, but no haggling, easy returns, luxury goods. It was really the women of Chicago, and especially the wives and daughters of Chicago's middle and upper classes. And it was phenomenally successful. He really worked to transform shopping from something you had to do to something that was a leisure time activity. But unfortunately, by the 1860s, his health is in decline and he has to sell his business. So he turns to two young men working at a competing dry goods firm. One of them was a bookkeeper and a credit man named Levi Leiter, brilliant young man. The other was a young man named Marshall Field. This is Marshall Field. Interesting guy. Born in Massachusetts, son of a farmer. He himself was a terrible farmer, for which we can all be probably very grateful. Still in his 20s at this point, but in the 9 years that he'd been in Chicago, he had risen at this competing dry goods firm. He had risen from salesman to full partner, 9 years. He was the kind of guy who would work 14-hour days every day. He actually lived in the store for a while, always knew everything in stock, read fashion magazines, first guy in the store in the morning, last one to leave at night. Brilliant. So Field and Leiter joined forces, and in 1865, they opened the new firm of Field, Palmer, and Leiter. Business went up and down, but eventually, by 1868, they had reorganized as Field and Leiter, and they had moved to this building at the corner of State and Washington Street. They moved into this building in 1868. Potter Palmer, by this point, had returned to Chicago and decided that Lake Street has no future. He's going to shift Chicago's commercial axis from Lake Street to State Street. for no other good reason than that State Street happened to be on one of the new streetcar railway lines. He bought up about a mile's worth of property, put up this lavish hotel at the south end, and this building at the north end, which he convinced Field and Leiter to move into. Opened to huge fanfare in 1868. The Chicago Tribune said it was the most lavish affair in the history of Chicago, the city of lavish affairs. But as it turns out, this is not a really good time to be opening up a business in downtown Chicago, because what's coming? The Great Chicago Fire. On the morning of October 9th, 1871, this is what the corner of State and Washington looked like. The fire wiped out the building and about $900,000 worth of goods. Field and Leiter make a critical decision. They say, we believe in Chicago. We are going to be a symbol of our city's will to rebuild. They resumed operations within 3 weeks. They found a site at 20th and State Street. 2 years after that, they were back at the corner of State and Washington in this building. Another beautiful building, wonderful French Renaissance architecture. They moved in with great fanfare on the second anniversary of the fire. And this building lasts about 4 years before another fire comes through, destroys the building, and it turned out to be about $1 million worth of goods. 2 years later, again, they moved back to the corner of State and Washington, to this building, which I think is the most beautiful building they were ever in. Beautiful mansard roof. You can't see in this photo, but there was a light well in the middle. Lavish use of windows. Gaslight was still being used at this point, so you needed as much natural light as possible so people could see the goods. This photograph, by the way, was taken in the 1890s. Now, not long after they moved into this building, Levi Leiter decided, and depends on your perspective, he would either retire or Marshall Field grouped his cronies together and they organized and kicked Leiter out of the business. Marshall Field now becomes the sole head of the firm, and the business is reorganized and renamed Marshall Field and Company. Now, one of the things Marshall Field did very, very well was to continue a lot of Potter Palmer's policies. This atmosphere of refined elegance, emphasis on luxury goods as well as everyday goods, strong attention to customer service. There was this famous story that one day Field was walking through the store and he heard a buyer arguing with a customer. So he went over and said, "What seems to be the trouble?" And the buyer said, "It's nothing, I'm just settling a complaint." And Field famously said, "No, you're not. Give the lady what she wants." It became this phenomenal slogan for the store because it really said, we put the customer's needs ahead of our own. And that was still really a new thing in American retail. He was also very, very good at promoting talented employees. And here's a good example. Has anyone been watching PBS recently? They had a show on called Mr. Selfridge about Selfridge's department store in Great Britain. Harry Selfridge, who was from Michigan originally, got his start as a stock boy at Marshall Field and Company. He came in as a stock boy in 1879. He was at Fields for about 20 years. Within 8 years, he rose from stock boy to head of retail operations. They used to call him Mile-a-Minute Harry because he would rush through the store with the tails on his coat flapping, constantly introducing new ideas, new concepts in retail. For example, this is the first floor of the store in the 1890s. You can see over here that it's still a full-service store. So if you want to buy a handkerchief, you have to ask one of these young men, and they will fetch it. The merchandise is all kept behind the counters. But what I'm interested in is over here on the left. This sign is not readable, but it says Kid Glove Cleaning Department. That's because Selfridge starts introducing services. You can get your gloves cleaned, your shoes repaired, photographs developed, pictures framed, lots and lots of services in addition to retail sales. Under Harry Selfridge's leadership, the number of departments in the store, they were always called sections at Fields, went from 42 when he started to nearly 150 by the time he left in 1904. This is what transforms Fields from a dry goods business to a full-fledged department store. This is when they add on things like furniture and books, things you never would have found in a dry goods store in the 19th century. In 1885, Selfridge turned the basement into a widely copied bargain basement, never called the bargain basement, always known as, anyone? The budget floor, yes. Someone said, if you lived in Chicago, you knew you had made it when you made your first purchase at Marshall Fields on the upper floors, not the budget floor, the upper floors, full price. Selfridge also expanded delivery. This is Holden Court, which was the alley that went through the store for years and years and years. This is how it looked about 1897. Can you imagine pulling those wagons in there? By this point, Marshall Fields had about 700 horses and 300 wagons to cover its delivery area, which was about 350 square miles. They had stables on the outskirts of the city of Chicago so they could change horses in the middle of the day. And Harry Selfridge convinced Field to start expanding. This is the this is the store as it looked about 1902. In the middle here is the 1879 store. They've added a few floors, so the roof line has changed, but it's the same 1879 building. Over here, at the corner of Washington and Wabash, is the first annex building, opened in 1893. Anyone know what's happening in Chicago in 1893? The World's Fair, the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition. Selfridge wanted Fields to be as much of an attraction as the fair itself. So they opened this phenomenal annex building, which is, fun cocktail party trivia, Spanish Renaissance architecture in a nod to Spain, which was the great funder of Columbus's voyage to the United States. It's actually the oldest remaining section of the building today. This building here opened in 1902. This was the next annex to be built. Designed by the firm of Daniel Burnham and Company. Burnham had been chief of construction at the Columbian Exposition, so this is a coup to get him. And it was very different architecturally. This building had all kinds of different size and shapes, windows and alcoves and things like that. The 1902 building, clean lines, grid shape, huge number of windows, enormous display windows at street level, columns. These columns at the entryway are 49 feet tall, said to be the second tallest granite columns in the world. So if anyone visits the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, let me know, because they are the only ones that are believed to be taller than the Marshall Fields. Now the plan was that once this building, which is really at State and Randolph, once this building was opened, they would tear down this building and put up a matching partner, which they did. However, before they could do that, in 1906, Marshall Field died, very unexpectedly. He was 71 years old, so not expected to pass away anytime soon. But very unfortunately, and here's a warning for all of us, should we be tempted to do so in a couple weeks, he went out and played golf on New Year's Day out in Wheaton, using red golf balls so you can see them in the snow, with Robert Todd Lincoln, of all people. They were good friends. But very sadly caught pneumonia and passed away. Now, at this point, Marshall Field is considered probably one of the 4 or 5 greatest merchants in American history. This could have been a real crisis moment. Many businesses have trouble surviving the passing of the visionary behind them. But Marshall Field had in place the perfect successor. Does anyone know who it was? Many would guess it would have been Marshall Field Jr., right? It wasn't. Sadly, Marshall Field Jr. died several years earlier. It's a little bit of a controversy, but he either, you can take your pick, he was cleaning his gun and it accidentally went off and shot him, or he committed suicide, or he was involved in a brawl at the Everly Club, the great brothel, and was shot, and they rushed him home and tried to hide it. You can take your pick. But in any case, he did not take over. His father outlived him. It was not Selfridge. Selfridge left in 1904, went to London, and started the great Selfridge's department store a few years later. It was actually John G. Shedd. You might know his name from the aquarium that he endowed years later. Shedd had been head of wholesale for Marshall Field and Company, which is really where the money was. To put this in perspective, in 1880, Field, Leiter and Company had total revenues of about just under $24 million. Of that, only $3.5 million came from retail. Everything else was wholesale, buying goods from manufacturers and reselling it to stores around the Midwest. It was Shedd who really took wholesale to its incredible prominence. I mean, really, in a lot of ways, Marshall Field and Company was dominating fashion trends throughout the Midwest because of the dominance of Marshall Field and Company wholesale. So Shedd steps in as the new president of the company, and very soon after, demolition begins at the corner of State and Washington. And in 1907, the building project ends. The store now has one unified frontage for a full block along State Street. And this new building is incredibly striking. Not only in its size, it's actually 13 stories tall, 3 sub-basements, but in its incredibly clean-lined architecture. Although it also was quite beautiful. In fact, there's something missing from this photograph. The clock. The clock actually had just not been installed. The first clock, in fact, if I go back to this photograph, you can actually see there's a clock there. Field installed the first clock in 1897. The story goes that people were tucking notes to their friends into the windows, and Field said, they're messing up the look of it, put in a clock, and then people can just say, meet me under the clock. Perhaps true, but many department stores did put in clocks. They're a convenient way to get people with no intention of shopping to be in the vicinity of your store. In any case, when the Marshall Field's clocks were installed, they were designed by Pierce Anderson, who was the architect of the building. So they designed to go together. Each of the 2 clocks is made out of, and Fields love numbers, so we know, 7 3/4 tons of cast bronze. That's why they have that beautiful green patina. The face of each clock is 46 inches across. And very quickly, they became icons of not just Marshall Field and Company, but Chicago, sort of like the lions at the Art Institute. In fact, I was watching WGN News a couple weeks ago, and I noticed their collage in the background where they've got the lions, they've got the Wrigley Field sign, I think the Wrigley building, And by golly, there's the clock from Marshall Fields and Company. Very recognizable. By the way, they are set electronically from inside the store. So if you remember, Norman Rockwell did a very famous painting that was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post on November 3rd, 1945, and it's got a humble watchmaker on a ladder, and he's pulled out his pocket watch, and he's setting this big clock using his pocket watch. Great image. It's at the Chicago History Museum, but unfortunately not true. The clocks are set inside the store. My favorite bit of trivia, in Roman numerals, what is the number 4 usually indicated by? IV, right? On the Fields clocks, it's I. Probably just so you don't confuse the 4 with the 6. It was not that uncommon, but one of those fun little trivia bits many people never notice. Inside the store, probably the most striking feature was the Tiffany mosaic in the South Rotunda. Again, the store loved numbers, so we know. It was 1.6 million individual pieces of iridescent glass that were installed over the course of 2 years. And then they destroyed the plans, so this mosaic can never be duplicated. What I find interesting about this is when you think about it, light wells by 1907, not needed. The store is now lit electronically. They could use the space for additional floor space, right? Not only are you losing space at the 6th floor, you're losing space on the 5th and the 4th and the 3rd and the 2nd and even the 1st floor. But the mosaic is doing something really important. First of all, it's adding to the experience of being in the store where you're surrounded by light and color. It makes going in the store a bit more of an experience of spectacle and beauty. It's also giving people a reason to come in the store because now every tourist guidebook to Chicago says when you're in Chicago, you must go to Marshall Field and Company and see the Tiffany mosaic. And of course, you know, if you want to shop, they will not be at all opposed to that. The other thing that this new building had that was done very well was an increase in services. Because now much of the 3rd floor is given over to different kinds of service. This is the reading and writing room, which had every major magazine, newspapers from 100 different American cities. In other parts of the 3rd floor was waiting rooms, lavatories, information desks. You could book a hotel room, you could buy theater tickets, send a telegram. They had a travel agency, a post office substation. You could have bought Cubs tickets for the last time the Cubs were in the World Series in 1908 at Marshall Fields. Again, it's a lot of floor space being given over. And it's not just the 3rd floor. There's a beauty salon in another part of the store. In the children's sections, you have the children's playroom. They also had a marionette theater. They had a barbershop for children for a while. A lot of floor space for services. But what it's doing is giving you a reason to come to the store and spend more time. It's becoming like the equivalent of a men's club for many women of Chicago. You come in the morning and you stay there all day. And if you're going to stay there all day, what will you need? Lunch. Money, yes, but lunch as well. Fields opened its first tea room in 1890. This is what the Walnut Room looked like in about 1909. It was not the first room. The first room started, according to the legend, there was a millinery saleswoman named Mrs. Herring who had some customers in 1889, and it was about lunchtime, and they were going to go home for lunch. Very few restaurants in Chicago's Loop served unaccompanied women in 1889. So most women went home for lunch. She was going to lose her sale. So Mrs. Herring said, wait, I have this fabulous chicken pot pie, my grandmother's recipe. Why don't you stay and have that, and then you can keep shopping? Which apparently they did. When Selfridge heard about this, he thought it was brilliant, opened a small tea room almost immediately, and from then on, every time the store expanded, they expanded the tea rooms. So by 1907, the entire 7th floor was filled with restaurants. And you can still, by the way, get Mrs. Herring's chicken pot pie if you go to the Walnut Room. This restaurant was originally the South Grill Room. All the restaurants were either tea rooms or grills, but so many people kept referring to it by talking about the beautiful walnut paneling, they changed the name. First it was the Walnut Grill, and then it was the Walnut Room. But there were also other restaurants on the 7th floor, the Narcissus Room, which had all beautiful Italian architecture, the English Room, and then over the years, other beloved restaurants that have come and gone. If you like ice cream, you might remember they used to serve Fields homemade ice cream in the Crystal Palace ice cream parlor. There was a Crystal Buffet. There was the bread and bowl basket. Do you know the Chicago Tribune ran the recipe for the old cheesy chowder soup recipe in September 2013? That's how much people remember the Fields restaurants. By about the time of this photograph, Marshall Field and Company now occupied a full block as it does today. And that same year, in 1914, they opened a new store for men. The store for men was across Washington Street. It was at the corner of Washington and Wabash, the southwest corner. The building is still there, 20-story building. The store for men was the bottom 6 floors and sub-basements. Now, why a store for men? Women were 80% of department store customers in 1914. Fields was hoping to get men to shop as a leisure time activity the way women did, because men did not shop as often as women did, but when they did shop, they tended to make big purchases. You know, a man might buy a year's worth of shirts in one trip, and they did not tend to return as much as women did. So Fields really wanted to cultivate the shopping habit in men. The store for men not only sold men's clothes and shoes and luggage, they had a men-only restaurant for a while. They had a sportsman's floor on the 5th floor. This is how it looked in the 1950s with that fabulous 7-foot stuffed bear. You can see from this photograph, I mean, they've got skis and toboggans and sleds and fishing rods and golf equipment. They were famous for making custom saddles here. They sold guns. At one point, Marshall Fields had 5 gunsmiths on staff and a shooting range, Fieldale Farms, out in what is today Hoffman Estates. If you have good eyesight, you might be able to see there is a full-size sailboat right behind the bear there. So if you're out on your lunch hour shopping and you need to pick up a sailboat, they've got you covered. So by the 1920s, the store is expanding so much, it's ready to begin opening suburban branches. Anyone know what was the first suburban branch store? It wasn't Evanston. There was one before that. Lake Forest. And what a coincidence. There were some Field family members living in Lake Forest. The Lake Forest branch opened, not in this building, it was another building, but it was in 1928. They moved into this building later on, and it was always a much smaller branch than almost any of the others. If you ever saw the ads, they always said, you know, it always said, not in Lake Forest, you know. It was always the exception to many rules. The next 2 branches opened in 1929, and they were this branch in Evanston and another one in Oak Park that was almost identical. By the way, you can see the architectural echoes. The buildings often had that use of columns that was so distinguishing the downtown building. But the downtown State Street store has this beautiful line of Corinthian columns right down the main aisle, as well as the granite columns at the entryway. Even these buildings, the Evanston store, has a kind of look of columns. They're not actual columns, but it echoes that. And, of course, the famous corner clocks being echoed there a little bit. So retail is doing great. But by the 20s, wholesale, precipitous decline. Chain stores are moving into the area. They do their own buying. Many small stores are buying directly from the manufacturer. Wholesale is dying. Fields decides they will save wholesale by putting up a new building. It will be a consolidated center for all Chicago wholesale activity, which was, of course, the Merchandise Mart. The Merchandise Mart cost Marshall Fields $30 to $35 million to build. It was the world's largest building when it opened, which was in 1930. Would you like to guess how much it did to stop the downturn in wholesale? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. In fact, Marshall Field and Company posted a net loss of $8 million in 1932. They were forced to start cutting wholesale departments and then slashing them. By 1936, all wholesale was gone. So the company would no longer resell merchandise except from its own manufacturing plants. The firm had been operating especially textile mills. Do you know the brand Field Crest Sheets? Started out as one of the Marshall Field's manufacturing operations, no longer associated with them, but that's probably the most famous of the manufacturing operations. And then you might remember in 1945, the Merchandise Mart was sold to a certain Boston financier named Joe Kennedy, who had sons who did something in politics, I've heard. So following the end of wholesale, the company's attention really turns to reinforcing its position as the premier department store of the region, and it's becoming famous for its legends, especially the Frango Mint. This is the earliest advertisement I have ever found for Frango Mints, and if you have good eyesight, you might see the price, $1.50 a pound. How about that? The term Frango came from the Great Frederick and Nelson department store in Seattle, which Marshall Field and Company purchased in 1929. Originally, it was not chocolate mint. It was not even a candy. It was a maple dessert, this sort of custardy, mousse-like frozen dessert. Actually, I have a menu from the English room somewhere here from 1950. This is my English room menu. And listed on here, first of all, they have the Fields Special Sandwich with coffee for $1.25. I think it's something like $15 today at the Walnut Room. But it has Fields Maple Frango for 30 cents. The term Frango was not applied in Chicago to a chocolate mint candy until after World War II. And then it really soared to fame as an icon of Marshall Fields. In fact, there's a long-running story, and I've heard this story right up until the name change in 2006, that originally it was Franco with a C, and that they changed the name when Generalissimo Franco came to power in Spain, and they didn't want their candy named after a Spanish fascist dictator, so they changed the C to a G, and it became Frango. This is the legend, and it's a great story. And then someone went to the U.S. Trademark Office and looked up the paperwork. Frederick and Nelson trademarked Frango with a G in 1918, long before Generalissimo Franco came to power in Spain. So most likely that story is not true, but it's such a good story. We'll leave it. Slightly more upscale is the 28 shop. This was the boutique within the store for haute couture. This is where you would go to buy designer originals right off the runway. Fields had numerous buyers in France who would purchase goods. Literally, they said 10 days after Balenciaga introduces a coat in Paris, you can buy it at Marshall Fields. And they really worked to get exclusive contracts. In the 1950s, Christian Dior, who was really at the peak of his fame, had an exclusive deal with Marshall Fields that the only place in the city of Chicago to buy an original Dior was the 28 shop at Marshall Fields. It was in the store on the 6th floor, but you could not get into it from inside the store. You had to go outside to a separate entrance at 28 Washington Street. Get it? The 28 shop. It also had 28 dressing rooms around this central salon. And you can see from this image, there were no goods on the floor. There were models who would model the clothing, and if you were interested in something, they would bring it to you in a dressing room to try on. What's interesting, sales were very good at the 28 shop, opened in 1941. But the benefit was way beyond the dollar sales, because it was a major way in which Fields established this aura of fashionability that extended to the entire store, regardless of the price point of what you were purchasing. For many people, the most famous tradition, though, was the walnut room Christmas tree. For many years, Fields boasted that it had the largest indoor Christmas tree in the country. And I'm sure they were unbiased in that. They actually used a live tree until the early 1960s. They would bring this tree in and haul it up the North Lightwell, and then they had a firefighter there 24 hours a day because, you know, fire and Marshall Fields don't have a good history. Someone who was a waitress there told me a couple years ago, they still have people come to them and say, "That wonderful balsam smell from the tree, we love it." She said I didn't have the heart to tell her it was an artificial tree. You can't tell from this photograph, but on top of the Fields tree for decades was not a star, but Uncle Mistletoe. Uncle Mistletoe was Marshall Fields' Christmas mascot. Introduced in 1946, developed by Joanna Osborne, who worked in the window display department. He was the go-between between children and Santa Claus, an ambassador of kindness, and my goodness, did he take off in Chicago. Fields eventually had Uncle Mistletoe toys, you can see here. He had his own little golden book. They made candles and cookie jars and ornaments and towels and puppets, you name it. Uncle Mistletoe had it. They hired actors to portray Uncle Mistletoe and his wife, Aunt Holly, at Christmas time. They had a club you could join. If you wrote a letter and told Uncle Mistletoe one act of kindness you did, you could join his club. And a major reason he was so popular, he had his own television program. The Adventures of Uncle Mistletoe ran for 3 seasons at a time in the late 1940s when television was brand new. Every kid with a television was watching Uncle Mistletoe. And he also had a radio program. So if you didn't have a TV, you could listen to Uncle Mistletoe on the radio. Johnny Coons did the voice of Uncle Mistletoe. He was a puppet in the TV show, but there were some live actors too. So wildly popular that Variety magazine said, in Chicago, this guy is hotter than Mr. Claus. And there were stories of kids coming to Cozy Cloud Cottage and being more excited to meet Uncle Mistletoe than to meet Santa Claus. By the post-war period, Marshall Fields delivery service was handling up to 95,000 packages daily. Fields was widely considered the premier department store. Their delivery service said, "We will deliver a spool of thread and we will pick it up." One woman actually did order a spool of thread once in a while to be delivered. And they asked her, they said, "It's fine, we'll do it, but are you a seamstress?" And she said, "Well, yes, I'm a seamstress, but really, I just like to see that green truck drive up to my house and make all my neighbors jealous." But shoppers' habits are changing. To stay the premier department store, Marshall Fields has got to move into the newest retail environment, which was the shopping mall. This is groundbreaking for Park Forest Plaza, which was probably the first fully conceptualized shopping mall in the Chicago area. Not the first shopping mall, but the first one developed as a whole. And I show you this picture because in the middle, that's Philip Klutznick, who was the great shopping mall developer in Chicago. But standing next to him, this is Houston McBain, chairman of the board of Marshall Field and Company. And over here, this is James Palmer, who was then president of Marshall Fields. The reason they are there is not just that there was a Fields anchor store at Park Forest Plaza. Marshall Field and Company helped to develop the mall. So they were there from the groundbreaking in 1949. Same thing with Old Orchard in Skokie, which opened in 1956. Fields was not only an anchor store, but helped to develop it. Fields did not develop all of the malls at which it had an anchor store, but it did happen more frequently than a lot of people remember. Certainly happened with Oakbrook Center, which opened in 1962. I show you this here so I can give you my street cred, which is that I was a sales associate there for a year. My grandfather worked for Marshall Field and Company for about 30 years in the linen department. Really, I have no association officially with Macy's or Fields. I'm a historian primarily, but that's my connection. Woodfield Mall, which opened in 1979, was named, it was the largest mall when it opened, largest indoor mall. But its name came from Robert Wood, who was chairman of the board of Sears, one of the anchor stores, and Marshall Field, the great visionary of Marshall Field and Company. So you take Wood and Field, and you get Woodfield Mall. So even though this particular store is now Macy's, the name Field lives on in the mall's name. This is really the trend of the 60s and the 70s. Major malls throughout the Chicago areas begin to have Marshall Field's branch stores. And much of the company's profits is coming from the branches. But the downtown store starts to lose something. Certainly Marshall Field starts to lose a lot of what had distinguished it when most of its revenue was coming from the one store, the State Street store. Competitors are moving into the Chicago area. This is the era when Lord & Taylor comes to Chicago, Neiman Marcus comes to Chicago, more and more competitors for the same target market. Specialty stores start to outdo Fields. This is the toy department as it looked in the 70s. This was once the largest toy department in the country. Now it's competing with discount toy stores, chain toy stores, stores that are in suburban areas and have parking, which of course had been a crisis for State Street dating back as early as the 20s. Trying to keep the State Street store looking fresh and modern is becoming harder and harder. This is what the first floor looked like in about 1979. Still got the beautiful Corinthian columns, but now they have this track lighting just kind of slapped on there, even though it's a bit jarring architecturally. They've taken out what were originally those beautiful mahogany counters, and they put in these glass and chrome things. It's a hodgepodge now. But there's just not enough business at the non-shopping mall stores to justify major updates. The store for men closed in the early 1980s. The Evanston and Oak Park branches closed after the 1986 holiday season. In downtown Chicago, stores up and down State Street were closing, especially in the 1980s. That's when Goldblatt's and Montgomery Ward's closed, the original Sears, Charles A. Stevens, Wieboldt's. At one point, there had been 7 department stores on State Street. By 1990, there were 2, Carson Peary Scott and Marshall Field and Company. You might remember if you lived here, they tried to stop the attrition by turning about a mile or 2 of State Street into a transit mall, buses and taxis, and it did nothing to stop the trend. It might have even accelerated it. But Marshall Field and Company did have one big supporter, and that was Battis Industries. Battis was a subsidiary of British American Tobacco, which purchased Fields in 1982 and started to bring back some of the glory. They undertook a 5-year, $115 million renovation that overhauled the store's look. This is the first floor after that renovation. They put in fixtures reminiscent of the original mahogany fixtures. They've put in recessed lighting up here that doesn't compete with those Corinthian columns as much. They reorganized department locations. This was the end of the budget floor, and the 4th floor was no longer the children's floor, to many people's dismay. They gave many departments complete overhauls. The major objective was to unify what are really 5 separate buildings around a central 11-story atrium with this beautiful escalator bank. This had been Holden Court. If you remember, you used to have to go outside to duck between the State Street and the Wabash Street parts of the store. Now it's all enclosed in this backlit atrium. It was a brilliant renovation. But for many people, the biggest change had already happened, because when Battis Industries acquired the company, it marked the end of Marshall Field's as an independent, Chicago-based company. Battis acquired the company in '82. In 1990, Dayton Hudson acquired the company. Dayton Hudson later renamed itself Target Incorporated. May Department Stores acquired Marshall Field's brand in 2004, and 1 year after that, Federated Department Stores took over May. Federated has since renamed itself Macy's Incorporated. And finally, in September 2006, close your eyes if you are very sensitive, all Marshall Field stores were officially renamed and rebranded as Macy's. So, today, the building operates as Macy's on State Street. It's one of Macy's 4 specialized flagship stores. Much remains. Many of the things that we mentioned when I first started are still there. Certainly the clocks, still there. The walnut room, the window displays, the Tiffany mosaic, all still there. Frango mince, the special sandwich, still there. The building is a National Historic Landmark and a Chicago landmark. That's why those plaques, you can't really see them here, but they say Marshall Field and Company. They must remain as part of the Chicago landmark status for the building. So if all that stuff is still there, again, why did Chicagoans feel so strongly about this store? So much so that to this day, people still refuse to go into Macy's because they were so angry about the name change. I think a big part of the emotional reactions have to do with the deep personal connections people had with this store. People in Chicago grew up with Marshall Fields. You went there every Christmas. You went school shopping there. You had your wedding registry there. You remember how it felt. Someone reminded me, when you bought hosiery at Fields, the saleswoman would open up the box and put her hand in the nylons to show you the color and how sheer they were. The way that that made you feel. Someone else said, you know, you might buy your everyday clothes and shoes at Goldblatt's or the fair or whatever, but if it was an important event, you know, if it was your daughter's wedding or your son's graduation, you shopped at Marshall Fields. That's how you knew you'd made it. I think that's a big part of it. But I think there's even more. I think the tactics this company used from the beginning, elegance, fashionability, high standards of customer service, quality consistently, these were fundamental. These became the brand long before the term brand was ever used. It was such a powerful brand, it did what good brands do, which is to inspire loyalty and pride from its customers. In the broadest sense, Marshall Fields and Company was a part of the transformation of Chicago from a rough and tumble frontier town into one of the nation's premier cities for business and culture and art. It was part of Chicago's civic identity as a first-class global metropolis. That, I think, is the thread that goes back to 1852. For a lot of people, that's what was broken when the name change happened. The thread of traditions and memories stretching all the way back to the beginning. Having said that, I will finish up and say thank you. Thanks for coming, and I appreciate it.